discuss today was, especially in middling debate rounds, or like if you're not really in the best room yet, or it's very like it's not a very good tournament or whatever, which is not the case in IDAS, but like it will happen to you in life. How do you steal the moral high ground in a debate? Like, it is you always deal with teams who are saying that something is better than nothing, at least we have to do something, at least we can help the women, at least we can help the poor. How do you strategize such that you win the moral high ground in a debate where it seems like your opponents are helping poor people, or are helping women, or are helping children? So for example, in topics like affirmative action for women or racial minorities, or topics like going online to entrap pedophiles to protect children, or giving financial reparations to indigenous people, and things like that. So what I was going to do today is prescribe a set of strategies that you can use in those situations, and just throw topics at you and ask you to try to steal the moral high ground and to appear like the good guys in the debate. Okay. So, what I usually recommend in situations like this is, so if you have an opponent that is saying, I am helping all these vulnerable actors, here are the ways I am doing it, is really just to say, look, we understand their concerns, we understand the problem to some extent, we think their solution is really misguided, we think their solution ends up hurting the people that they're trying to help. Okay? So, no, was anyone here in my elective this morning? No. Okay, just checking so I can use this. You guys were there.
Elective or?
My exercise. You were there, so I won't use the same topic. So let's say my topic is, this house would take obese children into state care. So I'm going to construct an argument. You need to respond to it in a way that steals the moral high ground. So let's say my case is, so ladies and gentlemen, we have engaged the parents of these families. We've spoken to them, we've invited them to guidance counseling sessions, maybe we've even put them under behavioral counseling, we've made them speak to nutritionists, we've done all these things to engage the parents of these kids, to point out that their kids have problems. We may even have offered them like food plans and things like that. If despite all of these things, the children continues to be obese for after a year or so of us trying to intervene, we think the state needs to come in. Why? Obesity is a very dangerous health condition. For adults, it's a perfectly acceptable lifestyle choice because they bear the burden of the risks they undertake and they get to enjoy the effects of taking these risks. But for minors, we think it's unacceptable because their parents are supposed to act in their best interests. And obesity is objectively bad because of the health risks it entails, because how it can worsen life outcomes for these children later on, make them more susceptible to certain illnesses, reduce their life expectancy. So we as the state think this is bad and terrible and irresponsible parenting. We would like to draw a parallelism to child abuse. We think you're incredibly negligent, if not potentially reckless and irresponsible, if you allow your children to continue to subsist on dangerous diets. Therefore, sustained what we will do is the same thing we do in cases where kids are proven to be victims of physical abuse or neglect. We are going to confiscate these kids from their parents and take them into state care, where they will be subject to a rigorous program, rigorous diet plan, and supportive counselors to help them lose weight and become more fit. That is our model. We would like to protect children. Okay, so tell me how you will steal the moral high ground from a team that is just trying to protect children.
You could introduce like a competing way of caring about children, and like even re-describe what they were talking about as far as this is like child abuse. We think there's psychological harm that goes along with that, and in this case we don't see that as much, but we would see it if you took those kids from their children and you're actually hurting them just objectively in a different way.
Cool. I think that's where you're gonna go. So can someone try to like re-characterize the problem? Because my characterization is we've engaged with these parents as best as we can. They're just really stubborn. we've given them a chance, they've proven that they can't handle the situation. So how would you re-characterize the problem on your side?
Most of the time, the parents don't actively choose to give these children unhealthy food. It's because healthy food are naturally more expensive.
Okay.
Therefore, yeah.
Okay. So maybe you will say something like, look, not all of the blame rests on the parents, nor do they have complete control, right? A, healthier food is really just more inaccessible or inexpensive in some situations. What else? What else might you say? So you need to take down that characterization that the parents are really evil and dumb. Yeah.
Well, it's just if you've actually engaged parents in these proper conversations and dialogues, and you've done exactly the way your policy sets up, but it's only evil parents who would then purposefully still not fix the situation, and at the point when parents are aware of the problem and haven't been engaged in these conversations, at the point where children are still obese, the responsibility can't possibly lie on parents, that they aren't inherently evil, that they do care about their children.
Potentially, but then you have to oppose the motion. And somehow this motion has always come out in tournaments, I'm not sure why. So you need to find a way to show that what I'm doing is worse for the kids, or that casts doubt on the characterization I'm giving. So like maybe one thing you say is, even if you regularly engage the parents, they simply do not have full control over their kids. So that's one thing you say. You go, part of the intervention has to happen on the school level, like in terms of the food that's available in schools. What else might you say to cast doubt on what I'm saying? Or what counter are you going to have? I know that it's difficult, and I've purposely made it difficult, but you need to find a way to break it.
Some problems of obesity lie in genetics.
There's that too.
So that's still just another thing.
Probably how parents are not at fault.
Okay.
Most of the time, parents do encourage their children to eat vegetables or healthy food, but the children actively make the decision to, let's say, eat junk food like McDonald's.
So maybe be a bit careful about that. Like on the one hand, you can say it's not parents' fault in all these situations. Like sometimes kids, I mean, how many of us always follow everything our parents tell us in terms of not drinking, in terms of diet? Though, presumably in some situations, parents may have not prevented it enough. Yeah, but yes.
Children don't like being obese. We don't think that it's nice when you're at school and you get abused by your friends, when you get bullied on a day-to-day basis, when you see adverts telling you that thin is beautiful. We don't think that kids like it, and we think that they would change it if they could, and we don't think it's the parents linked to the child that is the reason that they can't. We think it's societal pressure. I mean, like societal constructions of food, unhealthy options, all of that sort of thing.
Okay. So I think, can someone put everything you've been talking about together into like a coherent counter-narrative that sounds just as persuasive? You need to make me sound misguided. Like, you need to make me sound like my characterization of the problem is too simplistic. Someone take a stab at it. Okay, go.
Okay. We live in a world in which big fast food chains use advertising techniques to convince people all the time that their products taste better and that their products are more healthy. We live in a world in which people put sugars into foods unnecessarily, when they put fats into foods all the time to try and make them more bought and to try and make them better. We live in a world in which you can't possibly link somebody's obesity to their parents and the kind of situations that they live at home, when there's so many other influential societal problems that we think by removing the child from the parents' care, you don't address these bigger issues, and instead you just cause psychological harms and break up families.
Okay. Do you wanna... So the first part, let's break it down. First, the first part is you want to reduce the complicity of the parents, right? The second part is when you talk about how my solution might actually worsen the problem for the kids, and how the state is still better off upholding the ability of parents to raise their kids. Like, that might not be a perfect system, but clearly they are not fully at fault, and taking them away, second part, is dangerous. So you do both. Let's focus on the first part first. I think the second part is easier to do, but we'll do it also, we'll work on it. So the first part is, look, this problem is bigger than the parents themselves. It is a wider cultural problem, right? a lot of this is advertising, especially targeted at low-income communities and targeted at children. Some kids might be more vulnerable to this than other kids. We don't doubt that, you know, the parents potentially warn them, but it's quite possible that they just don't follow their parents' instruction. And reasonably, how many hours a day are kids really under the watch of their parents? Like, they are in school 8 to 9 hours a day every day. If their parents have work, sometimes the kids fix their own dinner. And like, it's a bit too much to expect of parents to police with their kids every single time. Especially if both parents have to work, right? I think we can see there is space for parents to do more, and the only solution we can have is just to keep engaging these parents and keep explaining to them why their kids need to be healthier. Like, we accept. I think you just have to go, yeah, we accept. If the government side is telling the truth, that the state would have tried to engage these parents already. You can drive it up a notch by like offering them incentives if their kids lose weight. Yeah.
It seems to me like from your characterization, you should then rather try and put the emphasis on engaging the children. If it's
potentially, yes. So that can be your next step. So basically, we're trying to devise like a counter plan. Not exactly a hard counter plan, but you're just trying to show that things can still be done. So you're right, I agree with you. Because it's too easy for me to get away with saying, we've done everything, this is the last resort. And you're like, have we really done everything? There are ways of engaging these kids without necessarily taking them into state care. So have separate one-on-one meetings between them and their guidance counselor. Offer them incentives for losing weight. Even offer their parents incentives for losing weight. Like a bonus if necessary, or I don't know, like, for in the case of the kids, like work on their self-esteem, show them how it's connected to their weight. So like try to develop a counter role. And you can go, if this, maybe opening government is right, that we've engaged the parents, but we are inclined to believe the state simply hasn't tried enough. And if the state has this avenue to just confiscate kids, we think that reduces its incentive to meaningfully and sincerely engage with parents, because this seems like an easier solution. You just throw all the kids together into a fat camp and fix it, which is lazy of the state to do. So, like, you portray me as lazy, and so you explain that there are alternatives, like engaging the kids without confiscating them, engaging their parents more, providing incentives, dealing with cultural problems as well, not blaming the parents entirely. Okay, so that's your first step. You're trying to recharacterize the problem as not the same as what I've said, right? A bit different. Now, how will you next show how my solution is actually not in the interest of the kids? The easier part, I think. Why does fat camp, taking kids out of parental care, harm them more?
You go to vigorous physical activities which might inflict physical and psychological harm to the children.
Okay, so what if I said it was calibrated exercises? Like, we won't like work them to death, but the other part still stands.
You're taking them away from the community.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, they lose their support system.
Okay.
Basically, the parents and all. That.
Okay, what else? So you're removing them from their immediate community and their support systems. And then, go on. What else are you doing to these kids? What other problems do these kids have? Yeah.
So a lot of the time, these kids are particularly sensitive because of the way that they've been treated at school and the way that they've been treated during their lives. And you're taking all of them and saying, you definitely have this problem, you are one of the people, you are somebody who's obese, and you need some severe way of treating you and changing your mind, which is really harmful to them.
Okay, there. So these kids already have self-esteem issues, right? They're probably struggling from being bullied already. What the state does is a form of institutionalized bullying to some extent. That is disguised as we will help you, but that is not how the kids will receive it. You are taking them all away from their homes and their schools. You're putting them into one area where they're all like fat. And then you are telling them there's a problem with you, we must change you. But in the process, you are stigmatizing them even more. And you are making them feel like, in a less, I guess you go in a less supportive way, you're making them feel the pressure or like telling them that they're a problem. And then you explain that you've taken them away from their parents, whom they probably love, and their families, and they feel isolated, and they feel like the state is overly intervening in their lives. Then I guess the second level might be, while they are in state care, it might be easy for them, like they have no choice, because they will be fed healthy food and they'll be made to undergo a serious physical regimen. But they can't be in state care forever, right? When they leave state care, it is quite possible that the old habits will kick in again, especially if the unhealthy eating habits were an outlet for stress and for depression and for low self-esteem. Yeah.
Isn't another way of trying to steal the moral high ground here, if we characterize it with our narrative that it's not the parents' fault and that they don't have all of this influence, but instead it's children's decisions themselves, that we are okay with those decisions if it makes those children happy, even if it makes them unhealthy.
That might be a bit dangerous though, because they're children, so they can't really fully appreciate the consequences of these decisions. But the health risks bite them in the ass when they become adults. So I would struggle to say in a world, in this debate, and just go, well, kids choose to be obese, let them be. Like, it might be too risky for you. I think what I would say is this doesn't, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, they have agency, they get to make these choices, because unless you put them under lock and key for like 24 hours, they will make these choices. So in what world are you better able to persuade these kids to do what is good for them? In a world where you're engaging them but still respectfully and not uprooting them from their families, or like in a world where they are in a controlled environment but repeatedly being told by a state that something is wrong with them and made to feel bad about themselves. Or they're probably upset, they'll graduate later than their peers. People are probably laughing at them, like when they go back to their communities, if they go back. They'll be like, oh, were you sent away to fat camp for like 2 years? Like that is pretty, that is pretty traumatic for children, just makes them resentful and less receptive to the message of the state. Okay. Any other ways you would steal? I think like if you've run that case, you can decisively persuade the judge that I might be wrong, right? What else? Anything else? Yeah.
I think there might be something to be said about children if it is forced on them going to fat camp, returning to old lifestyles once they leave, and that if it isn't them actively coming to that decision themselves or being engaged or understanding why properly, then you don't solve anything.
Yep. Yeah.
The
relapse argument. Okay. Any other questions? Cool. Let's move to another motion. I'm just going to keep throwing, I want this to be workshop based. So, online entrapment to catch pedophiles, right? So I will say, let me build a case in my head. So, law enforcement, so pedophilia is a giant problem. And recidivism is also a really giant problem. Sometimes after we've caught pedophiles and counseled them, they end up doing the same thing again. So we are faced with two levels of this problem. One is catching them, and two is making sure they don't repeat offend. At the same time, the internet is a very powerful tool for pedophiles, and it has made law enforcement so much more difficult. Because in the past, pedophiles had to actively pursue children physically, spend some time with them and earn their trust. But that made it easier to monitor and easier to spot, if someone is always trying to talk to a child in school or in the playground or in a cafe. But now that pedophiles have the internet as a tool and the children are very trusting, their work is a lot easier, and the only point at which we can intervene usually is the point at which they are already with the children, and by then our window is very, very limited. It's very, very hard to monitor. But what pedophiles do online is that they gain the trust of children, they prey on their insecurities, they prey on the confusions they have during puberty, maybe they provide them some incentives, or lie to them and deceive them, persuade them to meet up, and that's where they do their dastardly things. And then they blackmail the children in case children end up saying anything compromising, so that they don't, if a child confessed to being homosexual or wanting to experiment, so they blackmail these children into not saying anything, because otherwise they will show the world, post on YouTube, whatever these children did or said. So pedophiles have a lot of power. The internet has magnified their power. Parents have a difficult time monitoring everything their children do online. Some parents are not even tech literate and don't understand how these websites and chat rooms work. Given how difficult the position of law enforcement is, we want to give them power to go into chat rooms and impersonate minors to entrap pedophiles. So what we are proposing is basically law enforcement agents signing up under names like Little Angel 101 or Lolita 202 or whatever, and chatting up potential pedophiles, or like waiting to be chatted by potential pedophiles, and trying to solicit an admission that this pedophile wants sex with them despite knowing that they're minors, and therefore to give them an opportunity to either further investigate and spy on this person or catch this person. We need to do this because we need to protect our children. There are very few tools available to law enforcement, and we need to give them the opportunity to do this, otherwise children are screwed. That is my gov. Yeah.
Find pedophiles who don't act on their sexual desires some of the most admirable people in society.
Okay.
I think that...
Maybe don't say that, but yes, that is where you're headed, yes. Okay, go. What were you going to say?
I think that very often people who have other sexual desires that aren't those attracted to children make mistakes, that they have sex when they're in marriages, that they have sex with people who they don't want to. And pedophiles don't choose that they want to be attracted to children. Most pedophiles really hate it. Most pedophiles find very, very hard to change this about themselves.
Okay. Then I'm going to go, well, if they weren't going to do anything to kids anyway, then I wouldn't have been able to entrap them. The one time, I could be wrong here, but this is what I'm going to say, so tell me what you're going to reply to me, right? What if I say, the ones that I'm going to end up entrapping are the ones with the intention to do something because they were acting on the basis that they thought I was a child. Yeah.
We don't think that the internet is a fair playing field. We think that it wields lots of power over people that they don't want when adverts pop up at you all the time, when you're visiting sites and links lead you to places that you never sought out, when it's very impersonal and disconnected from the feelings and emotions of real people. Okay,
so what is the argument you're making about these pedophiles? How will you characterize these pedophiles? Because I'm characterizing them as a danger to children, right? By virtue of the fact that they reacted to me despite knowing that I'm a minor and solicited sex, or also like led me into that direction. So how would you recharacterize these pedophiles? And how would you characterize what I am doing? Because I'm characterizing it as protection and simply acting on something they would have already done, like simply punishing them for something they would have already done. So using your analysis of how not all pedophiles actually act on their tendencies, how would you characterize them? The ones online.
What you're saying is preemptively convicting them.
Okay. How am I preemptively convicting or preemptively punishing?
Because they haven't actually done anything, and by international law it would actually be impossible to preemptively convict them of anything.
What if I say, remember, I'm not convicting them yet, like I'm just necessarily using it as a basis to use as a lead, or to take them to arrest them, not necessarily convict. But there is something in what you were saying. Just refine it.
Okay then.
What am I doing?
Basically what you're doing is you're tricking them into confessing.
Okay, very good. Okay.
In the secret.
Okay. So let's try to build that into a coherent narrative, okay? Good. So maybe you can say, look, not all pedophiles act on their desires, but they have them. It is actually an illness, and it can be managed. What you are doing with your knowledge of what the triggers are and what buttons to push to get pedophiles to respond is unfair. There's a line between finding the evidence and making the evidence, right? And through your ways of entrapment, you are actually manufacturing that evidence because you're tricking the pedophile into admitting that they want sex with a child, when in fact you are not a child, and that is the point. Like, it's very different if this interaction happened without your intervention and you happened upon it, right? Like if you had online surveillance or some child reported to their parent that this person is like telling me to take off my bra, that's very different to the pedophile doing it with you. Despite them assuming you're a child, you still are not a child. Next, go.
I find this convincing only if it means we're going to arrest them or do something to them. If it's just deciding to tail them because we think they could potentially repeat, I don't find the narrative that convincing.
Fair. Though, I imagine if you... Assuming if I defined it as it includes the possibility of arrest, you probably could challenge me on that. If it's about tailing, I guess you just spin that on me and just go...
Waste of police
just do online surveillance in general, but do not intervene in the conversations, because it creates perverse incentives on the part of law enforcement agencies to actually like push the buttons, and trigger certain wants and desires from the pedophile, which they shouldn't be doing. So maybe you just go, this power in the hands of law enforcement agencies is just too dangerous. If it was just like leads that you wanted, then improve your online surveillance in general, but don't resort to this. Yeah.
Well, I feel like the problem here is that like you have one team talking about helping children and the other team talking about helping pedophiles, which I feel like is lacking in clash in a lot of ways. So like, I guess if we're talking about like twisting to like who's helping here, like is there some way to twist this to helping the children instead of helping the pedophiles? Like,
okay, how do you, are you asking me if there's some way, are you saying?
Well, the only way I can think of
okay,
is
good.
like that maybe, you know, if you have the police, you know, flooding into these chat rooms using conventional techniques of catching these guys, and they'll just get sneakier.
Yeah,
like,
it's possible.
I mean, that's an argument I can think of, but I just feel like you have to hit the child aspect.
No, that's possible. Like if you go, then they will be aware that there's like this movement online, so it can drive them into sneakier tactics. Though the government team can come back and say that's what we want, because it'll give them a harder time, because all the other strategies that they might use outside the internet might make them more vulnerable to detection earlier, I guess. But I understand your concern, because I think OP should also. To be honest, I do think OP can win this debate even if they don't prove that they are extra protecting the kids. I think they can, but I agree that it could be riskier, but I think they can. Like I think if OP came up and said, we never punish people for their thoughts, we just punish them for what they do. This is practically punishment for thought crime. Yeah.
I think another spin you could try and make is if we, using police forces to tail people who we've set up an entrapment, a lot of them probably aren't actually going to follow through. Those who organically go online and find the children are, and so if we have police tailing these people and not tailing those, we have policemen.
Possibly.
We lose.
That's fair too. Like you can just go, look, if you say our resources are so stretched and this is a difficult problem to monitor, you might want to spend your time on the really dangerous ones instead of trying to get not so dangerous ones, or the ones who weren't probably going to act on their impulses until you happened upon them. Like instead of focusing on those, just focus on those other cases. I could make a case for how this might lead to lazy and very sloppy law enforcement. Like you just go around, cast your nets wide, and hope that someone bites and try to trick that person into confessing, which is not how law enforcement should work. You should be finding evidence, right? It's a struggle. This motion does come out. I don't know what the status quo is in the real world. Do you know if policemen are allowed to impersonate minors online?
Yes, but it would have to be a sting operation, because if they're doing it as normal police force, then they would have to state to the suspect that he's under surveillance. So it has to be done undercover, and that has to be approved by another court.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
My understanding of entrapment is that police are allowed to set up whatever situations they like, but they aren't allowed to like offer the person anything. So you can dress up as a prostitute, but you can never say I am a prostitute or would you like to pay me for sex. You can say almost anything else along those lines and be very suggestive, and then if somebody tries to pay you, then they'll get caught. Or
so they have to wait for the person to make the first move?
Yeah. Or set up a car that's completely unlocked and just leave it on somebody's street for 10 days with all the police hiding in the bushes with cameras, and then if somebody tries to steal it, you get them. That's done and is allowed.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I thought about doing just a broadly entrapment debate, but I thought it would differ according to context, like if it were drugs or if it were theft versus like this. I think it might be harder. Yeah, it's harder because one side is purporting to be protecting children, which usually most judges are like, yeah, you're protecting children. It's very hard to disagree, but I think something can be said about, we need to think about the rights of pedophiles too. Like, they have a right to think whatever they want. People have a right to think whatever they want. You are preying on their vulnerabilities here by hitting them up online and with a very very leading name and clearly with an intention to entrap. Like, that's a bit unfair. I've seen teams win rounds that way. I do think it's quite tough. Okay. Next motion that I want you to break. This house supports financial reparations for indigenous people. So, my case is, indigenous people have been historically marginalized by different blocks of mainstream society, be it colonizers or be it the new state or the new government that emerged after colonization. Many times they haven't really been properly subdued, like they've actually been in control of their lands, but they continuously get annexed, or there are continuous incursions into where they are. They're sabotaged through things like, viruses and plagues. There's violence done against them. Their land is confiscated for business purposes, for mining extraction, for building things on. And this is something that governments acknowledge throughout history, that indigenous people have been historically oppressed. And we would like to move forward by providing them financial reparations, because we recognize that this oppression has led them to be at a disadvantage in terms of either integrating in mainstream society or continuing to practice their culture. In terms of continuing to practice their culture, there is a cost to that, because that means they will be speaking the mainstream language. It will be harder for them to get jobs. It will be harder for them to feed their families, and we want to compensate them for that by giving them money. In terms of those who do want to integrate into mainstream culture, they suffer from lack of access to education, just general discrimination from people who think they're less intelligent, they're less qualified, they're lazy, and all these things. So to compensate for that, we will financially pay the families of those of indigenous people, across several generations. So that is my app. Please keep it. Actually, I think this might be the weakest app I've given. Please keep it.
The question is what you're actually trying to solve. Are you just trying to compensate them, or trying to, because you enumerate a lot of problems, but there is...
So assume I'm trying to do two things. Assume that on principle, I just think it is a fair and commensurate compensation. And second, I think it might be an effective way of helping them make decisions about what they want to do with their lives, because they have a financial cushion.
Probably problems you've mentioned, for example, they've been chased out of their land, having no educational access and all, does not tie down to their financial ability. It's more to government's policy, and with you giving them money doesn't really solve their problem, because they are going to be chased out from their land. They are still not having access to education, which you're saying. Okay.
So I'm not really solving a lot of the problems that they have, but I am making them financially more well off.
Right. Okay.
Go
in that case, you also talk about these people being marginalized by the society.
Okay.
What you do then is that you further exacerbate the problem, because society would then see as if they are taking money from the pockets of these people.
Cool. Good.
Therefore, marginalizing them even more, access to things would be harder.
Good place to start. Very good place to start. Anyone else? Anyone else? Yes. Were you going to say something?
This feels different to the previous ones in that we are changing the narrative. I don't feel we're questioning the effects of applying this policy.
No, you might. There might be unintended bad consequences to them of applying this policy as well. We need to explore. I think no one in this debate is going to question that they were marginalized. So in this case, remember with the fat children, we questioned my narrative of the problem, because we were like, is it really the parents? Who are you really blaming properly? And with the entrapment, we also questioned whether we were going after the right kind of pedophiles. In this case, everyone probably agrees that indigenous people have been marginalized. We will probably disagree on the solution. Yeah?
Maybe it's similar, but it's kind of different, because you reinforce this negative image you have of these people, and it will be easier for people to hate them because you're officially categorizing them as other different and weak.
Okay, great. So I think on op bench, you need to make a strategic decision here. You agree that they're marginalized, right? Do you agree that something must be done to correct that marginalization? Just not financial incentive?
Yes.
Or do you think let them be market forces?
I would say A.
I would say A.
Okay, you think something must be done, right? So, what might these other better approaches be? You're close to them earlier.
Yeah, but like as a physician, would you go down that road, like taking all that burden upon yourself?
I might. Because then otherwise Gov is going to throw back at you. What are you going to do to these indigenous people if you agree that we have screwed them over historically?
And
what might be a better approach?
And just be like, you're not being mutually exclusive. We'll do all of those
But
things.
then we will get there. We will get there. You will have to prove that it is mutually exclusive to what I want, and you can do that.
Okay.
We will get there.
Probably
You were close.
give formative action to them.
Okay. So one approach might be guaranteeing them spots in workplaces and schools. Yeah.
I think often indigenous populations aren't interested in integrating with cultures, and they don't have any value in money. What they have value in is their land and being able to farm it and being able to hunt animals on it.
Good. Okay.
And all of that sort of thing, which is far more valuable to these people.
Yes. Anything else? Yes, that. So if I were oping, I would say, A, we concede. We fucked over indigenous people. B, why do you think that money is what they necessarily want? In fact, money is quite short-sighted, because especially if you concede that they are marginalized by society, they're unlikely to get the jobs, they're unlikely to have access to the social capital and networks needed to make that money roll. Money is going to be used for consumption, but it will run out, right? Or that it will just be very subsistence level money. Next, you don't fix all those other things, structural problems that you talked about, right? We think what this does is that it reinforces the idea that they are lazy, it reinforces the idea that they can fend for themselves, and it allows society to say, look, we've already paid back our debts, we don't owe them anything anymore at this point. If they are still poor and if they are still marginalized at this point, that is their fault, not ours anymore, because we've already given them what they want. And it makes it very difficult to enact all those other solutions that might be more appropriate that you prefer. So I think you go to OG, to Gov and say, no, you cannot have all of this, because if they were so marginalized, that means the political capital to do things for them is also quite limited. And you have to pick your battles. And in some situations, we think it is actually better to offer them land, because so they can practice their culture and land doesn't depreciate, like it's a resource that they will always have. One moment. Or to offer them increased autonomy in terms of like their dispute resolution mechanisms, their legal systems and things like that, which are potentially more integral to their culture. But let them choose. Except that if you give them money, these doors are virtually shut because you are unable to drum up support from society to give them more after you've given them money. Yeah.
If the notion is like this house would do this stuff for them, I don't understand how you can make arguments that they don't have political capital, because this is implying that the government should make the decision irrespective of whether people are saying to make this decision or not.
I think there is space. No, it's different. You're not saying you have no political capital to do this particular policy. You're saying if you do this policy, you will no longer have political capital to do other things. Which is a pretty just. Remember, like it's the usual. If you grant amnesty to immigrants now, it will be very difficult to do other good things for immigrants later on. Because otherwise, it's very easy if you don't get to question other things that the gov wants to put on their policy. It's going to be very easy for the government team to just propose, we will solve world hunger. We're done. You know what I mean? Like it is valid for OP to say, okay, in terms of the fiat rule, we believe that you can get through what you're trying to get through. We think it's a bad idea because we think it makes it very hard for you to get other things done as a result of this. Because of right-wing backlash, because it reinforces all these norms. And then therefore, you have to pick your battles. It's an argument you can make, I think, in the real world. and you just go, our political capital is limited, guys. I think we should use it on better things. I mean, the op can come up and say, no, the gov can come up and say, no, it's not mutually exclusive, we can do all of these things. But they will have to prove that in the face of your political capital challenge. Any other thoughts on this motion? Then let's move on to another one. Any other thoughts on this motion? We do a minimum wage now. Were you there when we did the minimum wage one?
When?
Okay, I think you were there. I think it was Ryan. Okay, no thoughts on this motion. Alright, let's do... No, was anyone in my elective yesterday of motion analysis? I'm just trying not to use the same motions. Good. Okay, last one maybe, or maybe one more. So this house supports a minimum wage. So I am government. So I will say, ladies and gentlemen, in the bargaining process between employee and employer, especially for lower wage earning employees or blue collar employees, the employees are always at the losing end. Why? The employers just have too many structural advantages over them that they cannot counter. First, employers control the means of production. And if employees are unresponsive in a certain part of the world, they can just transfer a lot of their operations to the third world, where people are more willing to accept lower pay and lower wages. And because there is a surplus of blue-collar laborers and high rates of unemployment within this sector, employers always know that if one party rejects their offer, which is like low and pittance, they can easily move on to someone else who needs the money more and who would be willing to settle for that money. So because you have a surplus of laborers, and because employers have so many options, they can just move around, they can transfer the base of their operations, they can move on to the next interested party. Employees simply do not have the leverage to negotiate for fair and just wages. There will always be a downward pressure in wages. This is why the state should intervene in this market and set a minimum wage. We think that is a fair thing for a state to do, and people are entitled to a minimum standard of living if they render any work. Yes, that is our gov. Protect workers. Yay.
We probably use the characterization against themselves.
Okay.
Like now we characterize companies, corporations as very self-investing and very self-interested. How they don't really think of the employees that we employ, and because they are very capitalist in nature, you would want to give them more profit. When you have minimum wage, you set a bar on how many profit you can have with the same amount of employees. Therefore, they are more likely to lay off workers.
Okay, it could potentially lead to them laying off workers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you just paint a picture of the mom and pop shop on Main Street that wants to employ a 16-year-old in high school who can't work anywhere else, right? And
cool.
You know, they feel like they want to give back to the community, but it's just, they just can't pay them that much, right?
Okay.
I feel like that's just
cool.
It's a narrative thing.
So those are 2 responses already. What else? What else am I to say?
If you're gonna do that, I don't know if I would paint it as they want to hire a 16-year-old kid. I'd say most of our minimum wage workers are single parents, or at least at the right age where they are parents. So you're laying off someone who has kids and needs some sort of.
You can do both.
Yeah.
You can do both. Yeah.
Maybe to try and characterize governments reaching the number for minimum wage as being lagging behind the way economies in the countries actually work. And the problem is that if governments set minimum wage in changing countries and developing countries, that it's not enough money for people to actually live. And we don't think that people will just allow themselves to be taken advantage of by companies because they do wield some power in that companies can't work if they don't have workers. So we think we get closer to what people actually need to live meaningfully without a minimum wage that's set and that companies can just resort to because government has decided that's all they need to pay.
I only see that argument working for workers who would likely get paid slightly above the minimum wage, and now what the company is going to do is just not raise their wages because it needs to meet the minimum wage for others. You know what I mean? But so that could also hurt people in the next level because then their wages won't get raised. But I imagine the minimum wage will be higher than what many poor workers receive currently. Like otherwise then we have no problem, you know what I mean? So Gov is gonna come back to you and say, obviously we're setting a minimum wage to be better, like better than what they currently earn and pegged at the cost of living in that country.
I think a separate argument from that, you talk about how the governments can't make this like choice in a vacuum and they don't have any other control over what sort of policies the other countries are getting. It's more likely to allow them to just export their labor to developing countries.
So that's one. If you do this country in a developed world, it's going to drive the companies away to the developing world, so that's dangerous. Assuming I said if it's a global policy, it's probably still cheaper to go to the developing world. So let's try to work with what you gave, right? You said what these companies are going to do is they're going to be very profit oriented. So they're going to measure the value that employees give to their company vis-a-vis the minimum wage that they have to pay them. So the lower value employees or the more replaceable ones are just going to get laid off, which is worse for them because the only comparative advantage they had was their willingness to work for less. Second, it disproportionately harms small and medium industries and organizations who really just can't afford to pay the minimum wage. And it makes it very difficult for them to compete with the bigger players. So, in effect, you hurt the very people. Also, it can lead to a trend of mechanization and companies just deciding to automate most things if labor is too expensive. So, in effect, what you do is you make life potentially worse off for the very vulnerable people that you were trying to help. So, like migrants, for example, or like low-skilled workers, or less educated people without a degree. Companies are just not going to see any value in hiring them anymore. So they should lay them off. I think the rebuttal to that from my side is, if they had no value, they would have been laid off already. Like companies are not going to keep anyone there who has no value. The fact that they're still there means they have some value and companies will be forced to pay them the minimum wage. But I mean, off you go, no, companies will find a workaround and get rid of the people. Because like it's hassle and it's too expensive.
This might be like way too crazy. And my partner would never let me run it anyway. So, do you think you can just talk about how that capitalism is always going to have this problem continuously, and that every time the governments use a minimum wage law, they prop up the system of capitalism, and it just like ends up perpetuating it instead of finding like a different sort of solution, like workers' co-ops instead of private ownership of companies, and that we just think we actually need a paradigmatic shift of what
Maybe you don't have to say the first part. I see why it's high risk. I think you just go, we don't think the government should intervene. We think workers do have access to other tools like joining unions and forming co-ops. Those are the tools we would rather support.
Okay.
But I probably wouldn't go this whole, because I know what you're trying to say, the minimum wage actually makes it easier for capitalism to stay in place.
Right.
Because people are angry but not too angry.
Right.
And I think what you're trying to say is it's better in a world where there's no artificial like sense of security and that they're very angry.
Yeah.
But that might also undermine your argument that it is better for these minorities because at least they get something versus nothing. Mm-hmm. You might have to pick one of those two.
Okay.
Okay, any other things you will say? Yeah.
Probably like how when government sets this policy, it's a blanket policy which only caters to people who see there's a problem in this wage. Like most of the people in the lower class are very much fine with how much they're getting paid, therefore you're victimizing them.
Yeah. Especially if there are two parents working for one household, then they are not able to make it meet.
Do you personally find any of these arguments convincing?
No. But that's because I'm very I have a problem with neoliberalism in general. So I don't. But remember that when you are being judged, you're not being judged by me or an adjudicator with their personal identities. You're being judged by the fictive character of an average reasonable voter who is open to persuasion based on the logic and relevance of arguments. And they have no preconceived preferences, they don't come from anywhere, and they have no preferred arguments or preferred ideas. So if the argument is logical, they can be persuaded. Am I, as Sharmila, persuaded by these arguments? Of course not. I hate capitalism. So yeah.
Because I think most judges are definitely like that, and like 99% are like that. But
what do you mean? Are like me?
Are like that, where they're just going to actually be the unbiased voter.
They have to. They
Right.
have to be that, yeah.
But sometimes I feel like that doesn't happen. And so that's what, do you think it's smarter just strategically to try and account for judges and run like Marxism?
So the danger, no, that's a bit dangerous still.
Okay.
Because like that also requires, I mean, if I take your argument to the logical conclusion, that will be millions of really unhappy workers who will engage in like warfare that's going to be violent and bloody.
Okay.
And it might mean being out of job for a while. So it's also hard to defend.
Yeah.
I think I will try to pander to the more liberal side of those judges and just go, this is actually in the interest of those workers to not have minimum wage, because some of them will get priced out of the market, especially if they do not have the requisite skills. And it might be better for them to take on some jobs even at lower wages that will allow them to, some of them to rise above the food chain at some point because they have experience, whereas if they were shut out of it from the first place. Of course, my answer is, no one rises above the food chain for certain positions. It's just a dead end and you just do it forever. But again, you need to remind people in the debate of the terms in which the debate is happening and use government's characterization against them.
Okay.
But in life, yes, I hate capital. So yeah, you're right that some judges are quite liberal, but there are ways to, like, basically...
Be liberal.
Yeah. It's about... That's where stealing the moral high ground comes in. Like, you need to show that the very actors that the government side is trying to help are actually people that they end up hurting, because these are the unintended consequences that happen. I am actually persuaded that companies will mechanize and that they will lay off people. I am not persuaded that that's correct. Like, I'm persuaded that they should be stopped from doing that. Yeah.
But even that, like, so minimum wage, let's say $100, if you can hire workers for 70, 60, 50, like, it's still cheaper and is going to be in a few years' time to get robots anyway. Like, I don't ever see the point where workers can be cheaper than robots.
Eventually we'll get there. I'm not Tuna, I'm not very like robot, but like it's getting easier. For example, parking spaces are increasingly getting automized now. Some cleaning services are increasingly getting automized now. Or like a lot of restaurants now have like weird self-serve things. Self-serve checkouts in restaurants. Like it's, I'm sorry, in supermarkets. It's starting to happen.
Yeah, except that there's always one guy who waits by the side because they never work and he just puts the card in and types in a couple of numbers.
There's one of you for like 20 of them.
Yeah, but in the Netherlands, like in the train station, you find one of those places, they're asking no one in it. So someone will come, like, really rarely someone will come just to clean, but they will not intervene.
Yeah.
Like, do your thing. And also with like buying stuff, train tickets and stuff, like all those automatically.
Yeah. It's happening.
Yeah.
So I guess that.
So then we just need to get rid of capitalism.
Yes. Okay. So any other questions? We have 4 minutes. Probably can't do another issue anymore. But or maybe if there's a motion that you really struggled with on how to be the good guy for. Yeah.
We talked about like how you can break this idea of the good guy, like the other one. Like, what if you're a proposition? You have to, like, you gave me a lot of stuff about opposition, but what if I'm proposition and I actually have to propose this plan? And
which plan? This
like it's hurting the people. Like, for example, the indigenous people. I still have to propose it, and it seems. Like
okay, so my prop would be a lot of the other potential things you can do for indigenous people. Rely on a group identity. So for example, land is based on the assumption that many of them still want to go back to their land and practice in their land, which is not the case for some of them. They just want to be in mainstream society already. So how does that help them? Or giving them their own like dispute resolution mechanisms could still happen, but it also depends on members of that community wanting to buy into that like leadership, like dispute settling mechanism. Like sometimes they're a bit harsh on women, right? And what if some people don't want to subscribe to that? So the reason I would make the argument for money is it's very individualistic, so it allows each individual to determine what they end up doing with that form of reparation versus the alternatives. Though on op you can come back and say, but money is a finite resource, especially if you have no financial literacy. Then that's dangerous. Though I'm toying with the idea of, if I'm in Gov, I would propose a salary for life to get around that, yeah.
One group of people I find it hard to convince is private companies who make lots of debates about making Superman gay or whatever the case might be. So to that private creative artists and stuff don't have a moral responsibility to do good things with their artworks or with their creative works.
I hate those debates very much. It's because I just think they're so low impact. I guess an op you go, it'll be potentially very token, you will not have control over how the thing is portrayed.
You don't think the right response is to try and make people care about the people who write the comic books and that they should damn well
that too, what if your demand is not geared in that direction? Who is the artist really indebted to? I don't know, I hate those debates. Okay, so you have a gay Superman, yay, but fine, it's a fair question. I'd probably just go, if this artist weren't inclined to do it inherently, it just might be more worrisome how the gay character is actually portrayed. Not having a gay character alone is not a win. The context in which that character is portrayed is also potentially problematic. Next, artists don't have this moral obligation. They should do art that they enjoy, and that they should have freedom to do whatever their vision is and whatever clicks with their audience and their fans. Also, there is reason to believe that Superman will not be received in a good way by people who are attached to the identity of a masculine superhero. It's unfair to expect an artist to sabotage their own work that way. Plus, the message might not be even, people might be annoyed that this happened, and it might have a backlash against gay people. Yeah.
Also, another group of people in the debate about linking financial aid to population control policies to make people care about the unborn children. Anti-natalism arguments, people never ever seem to care about.
Is this the whole that they would have preferred to be born?
Or they might have preferred to not be born.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
think
really
you say
horrible to
we
give
never
birth
really
to
know.
people. Sorry?
I think you say we never really know, which is why we can't second guess the kids. Because
Nobody seems to buy it.
there are people who are born who commit suicide, who are unhappy about being born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But everyone's you're crazy to tell me I can't have a child if I want to.
No, I'm on the opposite side of the fence. I don't think people have a natural, inherent right to have kids. Some people don't deserve to have kids.
Okay.
But we can't police them, so they end up having them. So.